know what they're planning to do. You're calling state, yeah. I would have thought by July that they would have, right? Usually around July 1, they start sending out notices and updates. I haven't heard anything. I'm suspecting now it means I'll know on December 31st, right? Or January 1st, right? What they had done is they said, let's put together this pilot program, and then in 2 years we're going to reassess and see, what kind of pitfalls or holes or things happened that we weren't aware of or we hadn't planned for, unforeseen consequences. I don't know that the program was long enough to be able to see pitfalls and unforeseen consequences from somebody dying, because I don't think a lot of, it's only been 2 years. How many people have filed transfer on death deeds and then died? Probably not that many, right? But they're able to see maybe some holes in the program they have. One of them, which is there's no survivorship clause. There's no clear delineation as to what happens if you have a common accident. How long does that beneficiary need to survive you before they actually become your beneficiary, right? What if you're in the same accident? You're in the same fiery car crash and you both die in an instant. Who does that property belong to? Does it belong, did that beneficiary take? Did he survive you? Is he your beneficiary, or did he die at the same time? They don't have a survivorship requirement in there. And so that's maybe one of the holes that they need, hopefully they'll be looking to patch and fix, right? Typically in an estate planning document, like a will or trust, there's a survivorship requirement that says if this person is not alive on X number of days after me, then consider that they didn't survive me and the asset doesn't go to them, it stays in my estate, right? But there is no such information in that, in the transfer on death deed regulations. Have any of you had any folks put together a TOD deed? No.
Why don't you just do a trust and just avoid all these issues?
Yeah, that's why she's here.
Mostly, I think, because they're expensive, right? I would think that, if you're asking clients, why don't you have a trust, that's probably, right? Number one, you hear, well, I'm young, I'm not going to die. Or they're expensive, right? And so, I do have some clients where I've put together a transfer on death deed. I had a lady come in a couple of weeks ago. She's got end-stage pancreatic cancer. She's got 6 weeks left. That's all she has is the house. I'm going to put this lady through a $3,500 trust and fancy bells and whistles and make her go through all that. She just wanted to leave everything to her sister, so I just left her sister's name on a transfer on death deed, and we're good, right? Now the sister, once this lady passes away, that sister's going to need a trust now to hold that house, because the sister's only 40-something, and so she's going to live a long time, and so she'll need to think about putting together a trust. But I think that the transfer on death deed works well for some folks, right? There's some limited circumstances where you say, hey, I've got a way to be able to help you achieve your goal, and it's a little bit less expensive and cumbersome and time-consuming when you don't have a lot of those. You don't have the resource of time or money yet. So I think it's a good program, but it's pretty limited in scope. It doesn't work for anybody who has a minor beneficiary. If you want to leave it to your child, but your child is 8, this doesn't work. I can only put it as if it's an adult. It doesn't work for somebody where you want to leave more than one person, but you want an unequal distribution, right? I want to give, instead of 50-50, I want it to be 70-30. I can't do that on a transfer on death deed. And it doesn't work if you want to do anything fancy, like hold it in trust for them and dole it out to them slowly, let them have the income for the first 20 years and then give them the property when they're older. That doesn't work, right? I'm putting their name on it, their name becomes the new owner. So, but it is, I'm glad that it exists, because I've done 3 or 4 of them in the 2 years that it's been active. I've had some clients where I thought, boy, this is a good tool. This will work well for that guy. Yeah.
How about the tax basis on these type of deeds? Is it a stepped-up basis?
It does get a step-up basis for whatever interest the deceased party owned, right? If the deceased party owned the whole house, then they get a step-up basis on that. Right? Because I can have a transfer on death deed for a property that I don't own alone. If it's a tenants in common, I can do a transfer on death deed. It's for my share of that property, right? And so then that other person steps in instead to my shoes and owns my percentage. If it's a joint tenancy deed, I can still have a transfer on death, but it's only effective if I'm the survivor. Okay? So I have a joint tenancy deed. My husband and I own a property, joint tenancy with right of survivorship, right? I can prepare a transfer on death deed. But if I die first, it has no effect. That joint tenancy will take precedence and the property will go to my husband. But if he dies first and now I own the whole property, now my transfer on death deed is kicked in and now my beneficiary would take, right?
What if you have a deed that has two individuals who are not married named, and, 50%, 50%, 40%, 60%,
Mhm.
but it doesn't say TIC or JT? Is there issue?
There is a presumption. And so if a joint tenancy must be equal shares. So if it's not equal shares, the presumption is tenants in common, right? In fact, if it's silent and it's equal shares, the presumption is still tenants in common. The presumption is that you would want your asset to pass to your heirs, not to the other owner of the property. So, I mean, I'll see deeds from 1960 that's just silent. To Bob and Mary, or to Bob and Mary, husband and wife. That's a beautiful one, because that was how they took title back in 1950, 1960. I'll see these deeds. Just says Bob and Mary, husband and wife. So what is that? That's a tenancy common. Yeah. So if absent clear language saying joint tenancy or with right of survivorship, if you have created a tenants in common.
So in that situation, only half the basis steps up.
That is correct.
And same with property.
And it would end up in probate. Because it's a tenants in common, even though it's a husband and wife, it's going to end up in probate because they didn't have a trust, they didn't have a joint tenancy, so the deceased spouse's half goes into a spousal probate.
Trust, it's an individual's trust, even though you're a married person.
You can. So for a living trust, you can have a trust that you do alone, even though you're married. The problem with that becomes titling, because what can I put in it? I can only put in it stuff that I own, or my half of stuff. And even if you say, well, I own half of that bank account, or our names are both on title, but I own half of it. It's my community property, but you can't transfer the whole bank account in. You can only put in your half. So you'd have to start separating out your assets. But it is possible to have a single person trust, even though that person is married. Most spouses do a joint married living trust.
So if the property is actually held under your individual trust, and let's say if it's my own when I die, and then my beneficiary is my son,
Okay.
and then the property tax base will also get stepped up?
Not the property tax base. So there's two different, the capital gains base, right? I don't want the property tax base to be stepped up. Nobody touch my property tax base, please. So, but your capital gains base would be stepped up.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, if I hold a property in my trust and I pass away and my beneficiary is my son, the question was, is my property tax base stepped up? But I think you were asking about capital gains basis. So the capital gains basis is stepped up, but the property taxes, because it's a transfer from parent to child, would not change. If you'd said that the beneficiary was my nephew, now it's going to have a property. He will still get the capital gains step up, but his property taxes would be reassessed at that point because he's not a qualifying child or a spouse or a domestic partner.
Is there any documentation needed to prove that the property gets set up?
So what you would want to do is get an appraisal, because who you have to prove this to is the IRS, right? And so it's there's nothing that you file until that house is sold, right? Maybe my husband just died and my property tax base is stepped up, but I'm still in the house, and so nothing's actually happening. But in the year that I sell that, on my tax return it says, what did you sell it for? Oh, I sold it for $1.5 million. Oh, what is your basis, right? And then I have to say, oh, it was $1.4 million, okay? And they say, and that's it. You just put the number on the tax return. You only need to prove it up if the IRS comes knocking and says, ooh, tell me more about that, right? Where did you get that figure? And then you have to be able to support that with a death certificate and a date of death appraisal. Say, look, yeah, I know I bought it in 1962, but my husband just passed. He passed in January 2017. Here's the appraisal I got done. It appraised at $1.4 million, and then that's your basis.
Don't you have the choice of date of death or like 6 months?
6 months. There is an alternate valuation date. So you can select the date of death or the date which is 6 months from the date of death. Not somewhere in between along the spectrum, but those two exact dates. 6 months after the date of death. There's some very specific rules about when you can elect the alternate valuation date. It actually has to result in a lower tax bill for you, so it's really only applicable to people who have a taxable estate, and then you can pick that alternate valuation date.
If they couldn't get an appraisal done in those times, what's the best alternative?
I can always go back and get an appraisal, it's just gonna cost me a bundle, right? So if I had a client come to me earlier this year and saying, hey, we just sold mom's house and we sold it, I forget, it was something like $1.2 million. It was in Santa Clara, they sold it for $1.2 million, and he's like, can you do these tax returns for me because it's a little over my head now, I've gotten in a little too deep. And he had sent in a huge check to the IRS as a prepayment. And he says, we sold it before mom died, so we didn't get that step up. And I said, wait, but when did dad die? Well, dad died like 6 years ago. Well, we got to step up then, right? So they had never gotten the house appraised, but I found an appraiser to go back and do some kind of forensic appraisal to tell me what was that house worth in June 2000 whatever when this guy died. Now that appraisal cost that guy a bundle, right? But it was far less than what the tax was on all of that gain, right? And so even if a client says, oh, you know, it's been a year, 6 months or a year, or 5 years or 10 years, I can always go back and I can find somebody to tell me what it was worth on that date, but it's going to be more accurate, right? The IRS is going to give it less of a hairy eyebrow if it was done in the moment, right? And it's going to be a lot less expensive, right? It's going to be $400 instead of $4,000 for that appraisal, but it still saved this guy $200,000, so it was well worth it, right?
But if it goes through probate, you're not gonna have that choice. The court will select somebody and it will be done.
Yeah.
You don't have a choice.
That's right. So there's court-appointed appraisal. If this isn't going through a trust or with like a joint tenancy where I'm just handling the transfer myself, if it's going to go through the probate court, then the probate court has a court-appointed appraisal, and they're going to get that appraisal whether you want it or you don't. Yeah. Yeah.
If all of your assets, including investments, are in a trust, all of them get a step-up basis, correct?
No,
Then you don't need that.
you'll need it on most of them.
Yes.
Oh, yeah?
So, you say, well, but maybe I don't own it as joint tenants community property. We're holding these assets in a trust, right? And so, what gets stepped up if it's in a trust? I still need that step up in basis because the trust is helping me with probate. It's helping me avoid the probate court and all those processes and fees in the event of my death. But it doesn't help me with Uncle Sam with the property taxes or with the capital gains taxes. And so if the house is held in the trust, whether it gets a full step up or a half a step up depends on whether it was a community property asset. If it's a community property asset, it gets a full step up. If it's separate property and it belongs to the surviving spouse, it might not get a step up, right? Because I didn't die, right? So if I have a separate property account, it's got some stock in it, and my husband dies, and we have a prenuptial agreement that says that was my sole and separate property, it would not get a step up, right? So that's one thing to consider. But if it's jointly owned or community property, it will get a step up even though it's in a living trust, and that is important. And so, yeah, if a property's owned in a trust, we always get date of death appraisals for everything.
One other question, are you familiar with what
Everything.
happens if Medicaid, or whatever it is,
Medi-Cal.
gets
Medicaid's not a
involved,
problem. Medi-Cal is.
and we'll look back, and I know there's a way to protect a very limited amount of
Yep.
assets from that. Do you know what that is?
120 grand. So, Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal says, well, if we're paying for your
Nurse or something?
nursing home, we're paying for your medical care, we're helping support you on this government assistance program, and you're sitting on a house and you die, right? then if you've received these Medi-Cal benefits within the last 5 years, we're gonna